Hello, and thank you for watching. This is our college football best bets for week 2. Um, Last weekend was the first weekend of the season. It's finally over, and now it is time to look at some of the odds for week 2. Last week, in the first week, I was 3-1, and the only loss I had was a complete shocker. I took Arizona minus 11 at home versus BYU, and the Cougars pulled off the upset outright. Khalil Tate, the Arizona quarterback, who going into the game was a Heisman favorite, he didn't even look close to himself, and it was a really bad look for Kevin Sumlin, and in his first game as the head coach in Tucson. And it looked like Arizona started to panic a little bit too early and may have went for the home run ball too often. But I think Arizona will recover. It may take some time, but I think Arizona will recover. But I don't think Khalil Tate's Heisman campaign will be able to recover. So that was the one I was wrong on. But on the other three, I was right. The first one, I think this was the Friday night game. Western Kentucky covered the 34.5 point spread at Wisconsin, and it would have been. They ended up losing by 31, but it would have been a whole lot more comfortable, I guess. But they fumbled when they were about to score late in the fourth, and it made it at least interesting. They still covered. We still cashed. So won that one. And then in the 11 a.m. game Saturday morning, I had Kent State at plus 16.5 against Illinois in Champaign, and they did cover that spread. They were actually beating the Fighting Illini for a while, and it looked to me like they were going to pull off the upset. They did not, but it didn't matter. They covered. And Central Michigan also picked them to cover at Kentucky. They gave Kentucky all they could handle and did indeed cover. So, week 1 to me is always the most dangerous week of the season to try to pick against the spread, but week 2 is not very far behind week 1. Way too many people make the mistake of thinking they have it all figured out already, and they'll go all in this week, and it's just not possible to have everything figured out yet. I mean, you definitely have a better guess and a better gauge going into week 2 than you did week 1, but it's still very much an educated guess, and you got to remember that when you're placing bets. And having said all that, let's look at some week 2 picks. But before we do, as always, this video is not intended for anything illegal. These picks are all just for fun. So we'll get started with my favorite game on the board for week 2, and that is Central Michigan minus 4.5 at home against Kansas. Like I said a minute ago, I was on Central Michigan plus 17 against Kentucky last week, and they were able to cover the spread on the road. The Jayhawks, on the other hand, opened up at home last Saturday against an FCS opponent in Nicholls State, and they ended up losing to Nicholls 26-23 in overtime. Central Michigan didn't look amazing last week either, but I mean, they did end up losing by double digits at Kentucky, but Kansas is terrible. Central Michigan's a very respectable MAC team, and Kansas is the laughing stock of the Power 5 and maybe even all of college football. The Chippewas are 4.5 point favorites against Kansas on their home field, and I think the line should be much higher than that. I mean, the Jayhawks' offensive line struggled with an FCS program last week at home, so why do I believe they can handle a much better team on the road a week later? And another thing to remember when you're looking at this game is Central Michigan's 15-point loss is a little bit misleading. That loss last week at Kentucky, they were a whole lot closer than that for a lot of the game, and Kentucky just kind of pulled away with it in the fourth. For Central, their biggest problem last week was definitely penalties. I think they'll be able to clean it up at home, handle the 4.5 points easy, and I think there's a better chance of the Chippewas winning by double digits than the Jayhawks covering the 4.5. So that's the first one. That's my favorite one. I also really like Appalachian State. They're 2 touchdown favorites at Charlotte. And as you probably already heard, it was one of the bigger stories last week in college football, at least last Saturday anyway, is App State gave Penn State all it could handle in Happy Valley. They pushed the Nittany Lions to overtime, but did end up throwing a walk-off interception to lose the game. Charlotte, on the other hand, did not play nearly the opponent that App State did, but they beat Fordham 34-10. This game is just the classic don't overthink it game. App State has a history of good football and Charlotte doesn't. This is only the 5th year of 49ers football, and their previous 4 years have been absolutely atrocious. They're 8-29 all time. They were 2-10 last season, and their winningest season ever is a whopping 4-8. But with all that being said, the trends are actually pretty even. But the OddsShark computers actually have the Mountaineers running away with this thing 31-3. Again, don't overthink this one. App State will win this and win it big. Another game I took Mississippi State -10 on the road at Kansas State. Like their rival Kansas, the Kansas State Wildcats struggled with an FCS opponent to open the season. But unlike Kansas, K-State actually won. They beat South Dakota State 27-24 last week. The Bulldogs, on the other hand, dominated Stephen F. Austin from the opening kick. They did not have Nick Fitzgerald, and now he's back. This will be his first game of the season. And K-State, over the years under Bill Snyder, has been a pretty good, it's a pretty safe bet when they're a home underdog that they'll at least cover. But I think they'll struggle fairly badly with Mississippi State this Saturday. State is 6-3 against the spread in the last 9 games and 4-2 straight up in the last 6 away from Start Vegas. And K-State is 4-8 against the spread in their last 12 games overall and only 1-5 against the spread in the last 6 in Manhattan. I think this is much more likely for Mississippi State to turn this one into a laugher than for Kansas State to keep it within single digits, even though Mississippi State is on the road. So go with the SEC team -10 at K-State Saturday. Then the last game, I learned from my mistake last week. I'm taking BYU -3.5 versus California, but by the half a point, buy it down to 3 points. That way, if it's a field goal game, you at least get your money back. BYU is an 11.5 point road dog last week at Arizona and won the game outright in Tucson. I picked against the Cougars last week, but I'm not doing that again. BYU had a terrible year last year, and I mean, to be fair to them, injuries did have a whole lot to do with that. But I didn't think they'd be able to recover this fast. Getting Tanner Mangum back was huge, and BYU's offensive line had its way with the Wildcats last week. I think that'll continue this week against Cal. Cal had a fairly unimpressive win last week against North Carolina. They were up 17-0 and had to hang on to win 24-7 at home. To me, BYU's better than North Carolina. I don't think there are a whole lot of people that would argue against that outside of the state of North Carolina or maybe the ACC. And now the Golden Bears will have to overcome the Cougars' home field advantage. And I honestly think this is going to be a really good game, but I think BYU's offensive line is going to be the difference, and the Cougs end up winning. I think they're just going to be able to run the ball at will, win the game at home. A quick look at some of the trends in this game. Cal's only 3-7 against the spread in the last 10 away from Berkeley, and 0-5 straight up in the last 5 road games. BYU is 5-1 in its last 6 against the spread, but only 1-5 against the spread in its last 6 home games. With this one, the money is split about 50-50, but I think BYU wins by 7-10, which would definitely be more than enough to cover the 3.5, but buy it down to 3 just to be safe. So just to hit those one more time, those are my picks for this weekend. The first one, Kansas at Central Michigan. I like the Chippewas -4.5. Second one, App State at Charlotte. I like Appalachian State -14. Mississippi State at Kansas State. I like the Bulldogs -10. And BYU versus Cal. I like BYU -3. Buy that half a point down to 3 right there. So thank you for watching. As always, for more information, you can head over to JacksonBleachers.com, and we'll talk to you before week 3.